Hello, everybody. Just loading up Instagram. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am one of two lead faculty for management of the older adults and also for the clinical management of the fitness, athlete, pregnancy, and postpartum. Today I am turning on my pregnancy and postpartum hat to be talking about a topic that I've actually become really passionate about, which is teaching women appropriate bracing strategies. It doesn't matter, all women. And so we run an 8-week online course, clinical management of the fitness, athlete, pregnancy, and postpartum. We just sold out our cohort that started today. We have another cohort that's starting in May, and we have people already signing up for that cohort. So if you are interested in learning about all things female athlete, I encourage you to jump into that course with myself and Alexis Morgan. Okay, so let's talk about why this matters. So in general, and it's International Women's Day, so we're going to talk a little bit about this. In general, I would say that 95% of strength and conditioning coaches have been men. And some of our biggest thought leaders in this space have been men. And still, for example, I'm the only female lifting coach in my city. And this is starting to change and more women are getting involved in strength and conditioning. But the reason why this is important is that if you compare who leaks under heavy squats and deadlifts, it is 100% women, and very rarely are men experiencing pelvic floor dysfunctions with heavy lifting. Men are going to experience things like anal incontinence, which looks more like they're letting gas out at the bottom of a squat or a clean. That is more common, and Carrie Bow posted a study that showed that 50% of men struggle with that. That's probably not something that they're going to might be embarrassing in the moment, but not something that they would seek healthcare for. Versus 80% of women, thank you, I totally agree, this is an important topic. 80% of women can experience leaking of gas in the bottom of a heavy squat, and 50% of women, many who are nulliparous or who have never had children, experience leaking in the bottom of a heavy, specifically a deadlift or a squat or a clean. Those are like the heaviest loaded exercises. And part of the reason why I think this prevalence is so high is how we teach women how to brace. When we are thinking about lifting heavy weights, oftentimes we are performing what is called a Valsalva maneuver. So this is taking in lots of air, drawing your belly button in towards your spine, trying to stiffen up your rib cage and bear down. That is usually what is being told to be done. And that is an important distinguishing factor, and that's what I'm going to be talking about changing. So the reason why we do this is that it increases the muscular activation of some of the spinal stabilizers. It is going to cause an increase in stiffness through the thorax, which is going to allow better force transfer, and you can lift more weights. When we have a woman who is pregnant, we tend to get rid of the Valsalva maneuver for a couple of reasons that, to be honest, we haven't actually been able to research just yet. We're going to try and change that in the next little while. More on that. But there's a transient increase in blood pressure that can go as high as 200 millimeters of mercury. We haven't shown that is bad for the baby, but preeclampsia and gestational hypertension are two concerns during pregnancy and can become medical emergencies for a baby. That's number one. And number two is to try and protect the pelvic floor. And so it's interesting because if we change where and how we are bracing, are we going to protect the pelvic floor even with Valsalva? I don't know the answer to that question. I've thought about it a lot, and I have reached out to people much smarter than me who do research in this area to help me figure it out. So what am I proposing that we switch? Okay, so what I want you to do, if you are listening in your car, if you are listening on Facebook or Instagram, I want you to take a big breath, bear down, and contract your abs and feel that pressure come into your pelvic floor. We do that on purpose if we are straining to poop, If we are trying to have a child, that is oftentimes how we are taught, where we take all this pressure that we have built up, and instead of trying to contain it equally across all 4 chambers of our core canister, we start putting that pressure down on our pelvic floor. What that means is eventually the pressure that is built up in your abdomen is going to exceed the tensile strength of the pelvic floor muscles, and they let go of closing their sphincters, and you have leaking that occurs. That makes a lot of sense, right? And so a lot of times people think that they need to strengthen the pelvic floor, but why don't we just tell them not to bear down? Why not? And so this is where I think as female strength and conditioning coaches and pelvic floor PTs that are working in this space, we need to teach women that you do not need to bear down in order to seal in a Valsalva. So what do I tell my clients to do? You're gonna take a big inhale. Then you're gonna draw your belly button in towards your spine, kind of close down in that abdominal area, but you're not going to bear down. You're just going to create a tight seal. And it might seem very different. So I'm talking about drawing in. Inhale, take up all that space and draw in, not down. In, not down. And the reason why is so that we are not thinking about pushing at the top of a balloon and having all of that pressure go down towards our pelvic floor. And I think that's a really important distinction because it changes where you feel pressure. And you're gonna feel these slight differences even if you have never had any pelvic floor dysfunction. If you have never had a child, that does not matter. You will feel that shift from pressure being distributed across your abdomen to a pressure down against your pelvic floor. And if you think about that, now that's just pressure of us doing that in free sitting. Imagine if I have 250 pounds on my back or I'm trying to lift 270 pounds off the floor. Another thing about this is that we're starting to see more women are having leaking with Valsalva, especially with a squat and a deadlift, and in particular a sumo deadlift. And there's reasons for this. So first, I'm going to show you my pelvic model. We think about our pelvic floor. This is looking bottom up, and we have these muscles that need to withstand pressure. But we also have many of our adductors that are on our pubic rami. These are all magnets. I'm not breaking this model. That are going to pull on, especially when we're off the floor on a deadlift, they're going to be pulling on our pubic rami because our adductors are a really powerful hip extender in the sumo deadlift. It's going to create tension and lengthening of the pelvic floor. We are in a squat position. Some women are in a really almost like mini squat deadlift hybrid, and this opening is going to put even more, it's going to put the pelvic floor on even more length. And then we're doing a Valsalva, which is pushing down against the pelvic floor, and we're creating this perfect storm for not having a strong enough pelvic floor to be able to withstand that pressure. And so if it's failing, instead of like failing a chin up where all of a sudden you drop because it lengthens, in the pelvic floor you get that relaxation that essentially stops closing the sphincters, and you get this release of urine that happens. And so the additional stretch of the adductors that are putting an opening pressure on the pelvis in the sumo deadlift is making a woman even more vulnerable, and it requires even more strength to maintain that closed sphincter position. So the things that we can do is, one, if we are having women who are having pelvic floor dysfunction with Valsalva, we're going to teach the Valsalva. I want them to know the difference between bracing down and bracing in. Then if that isn't working, then we're going to be able to start working on modified breath techniques so that we can stack pressure and make it available to them so that they can return to Valsalva eventually with a resolution of symptoms. The last kind of component of this that I wanted to tie in is that this often goes awry when we also layer in the belt. I see a lot of athletes who use a belt prematurely, whether that be in their lifting career or when they are lifting in general. One, you should know how to appropriately brace without a belt. Two, you should not need a belt at 50% of your 1 rep max. Three, it is not a brace. A weightlifting belt is not a brace. It is not something that we use in order to make our backs feel safe. We are going to make our backs resilient through strength training. And four, your breath and bracing strategy should not significantly change with the weightlifting belt versus no weightlifting belt. I'm going to repeat number 4 because this is the one that I see most commonly in the strength and conditioning space. I am a lot in the powerlifting and weightlifting space, but I see it a lot in CrossFit too. Your bracing strategy should not change if you are using a belt versus not. What do I mean by that? I am almost 16 weeks pregnant, so I can't really use a belt very appropriately, but I'm going to try. I have a cloth belt here. I think we did a podcast episode on how powerlifting is going to need leather belts and how CrossFitters and weightlifters tend to use softer belts, cloth belts. And in general, we want them to be the same distribution across. And ideally for women who are shorter torso, they would have a smaller belt so that it doesn't bruise their ribs. That's an aside. If I am putting on a weightlifting belt, and if you're listening to the podcast, I'm just putting this across my abdomen, and I'm not going to tighten this up because being pregnant, that just doesn't feel very good. So what happens is instead of breathing in, drawing in, and feeling the bulging of your abdomen push into your belt so that it gives you that little bit of proprio, because what we know is that there's only about a 10% increase in muscular activation, which is super significant, is helpful, and will incur a performance advantage, especially in a strength-based sport. I want every percentile of stability and support that I can get. It's why it's not cheating. It is absolutely a useful tool when you know how to use it correctly. But what I see is that people have this beautiful bracing strategy, and all of a sudden they put on this belt and all they do is push their abdomen out against it. And then all of a sudden they start leaking pressure above and below, and you'll see segmental flexion, especially in heavy pulls above and below the belt, because now it's not being reinforced because they're pushing out against it. Or they'll start leaking pressure in towards their pelvic floor. And Carrie Bo's study in 2020 showed that one of the higher risk areas was when they were lifting with a belt. And again, I think that's because instead of using it as a proprioceptive cue and getting that little tiny bit of activation, people think that they need to tighten it so that they can barely breathe, and then they push out against the belt. And you see even like what they call, like when you see from the side and you see like skin hanging above and below because it's so tight and they're exhaling so hard against it. Again, it's like having this balloon and cinching in the middle of it. What's going to happen? We're going to have an excess of pressure that's going to go above and below the belt. Above the belt is your rib cage. You don't really have much space to occupy there. So it goes down, and it goes down against the pelvic floor, and it increases risk of pelvic floor dysfunction in women. And so what we are going to try to teach our athletes is, one, that their bracing strategy should not change. And sometimes I get my athletes to do reps and reps and reps of this, especially if they're experiencing leaking episodes, so that they know that you are using this as a cue. It is a cue. It is a bit of proprio. It's a bit of reinforcement and pressure. That's going to help with force transfer. It is not something to push out against, because it will not give you more stability. It may feel in that moment that you get more stability, but you'll only get stability across the band of the belt. You have above and below. And the last thing we want is for you to leak that pressure out against your pelvic floor, and then you actually leak. So cinch it, draw in, and you'll feel, because it's tight enough, that I'm getting this little band of pushing pressure. It does not feel good. My pregnant belly, I'm not going to do that anymore. But you're going to feel that little extra band of pressure above and below, and you are not going to be experiencing this pushing, exhaling out against the belt, or trying to like give yourself this Buddha belly and pushing out against the weightlifting belt. It does not help. It'll lead to increased pressure loss in the pelvic floor and can make you vulnerable to pelvic floor dysfunction. Okay, bringing that all together, women are bracing, and I would even argue that this is for both genders, but it is especially important for women when 50% of them, as they are lifting heavy weights, are starting to leak. So, one, we need to change our bracing. You can Valsalva, inhale, occupy space, brace in, draw everything in. The pelvic floor lifts up. We are not bearing down. No bearing down, unless you are giving birth, and we would even try and advocate for open glottis pushing in that instance, but that is a whole other topic area. Draw in. Number two, you should be able to differentiate, or you should not have to, have a change in breath strategy. There should be no differentiation in strategy between when you are using a belt and when you are not. Adding the belt should only be done around 75 to 80% of your max loading. Your warm-up sets, you should not need them. Your back is strong, your back is resilient, and you should learn how to force transfer before adding a belt. That could mean not using it if you were a new lifter until you really have a solid bracing strategy, or it could mean, as someone's calling my clinic, it could also mean that you are not going to be using it until you're at a certain percentage. And you should be doing reps and accumulating volume underneath those thresholds that you feel comfortable and confident in your bracing strategy. I hope you found that helpful. This is a conversation that I think we need to shout from the rooftops, not only in the PT world, but in the strength and conditioning world. We need to know that women's anatomy is different. We're seeing differences in anatomy, and it's so important for us to be thinking critically about how we can advocate for our female athletes to bring this prevalence down from 50%. We can do it. We can advocate. I hope you all are going to have a wonderful Monday, and thank you so much. And hopefully we see you in our next cohort of clinical management of the fitness athlete, pregnancy and postpartum.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.